guys. Welcome to episode 30 of the Data Driven Strength Podcast. Today, Josh and I are going to go over a few things today. We're going to talk about the benefits of velocity-based training. We're going to talk about proximity to failure with specifically low-load training and how that influences adaptations in strength and hypertrophy. And then finally, we're going to potentially get to a client case study and some listener question if we have time at the end of the show. But without out of the way, let's go ahead and kick it over to Josh here. Josh is going to start off the podcast here talking about the benefits of velocity-based training and kind of just a little bit of the entire rationale for why VBT has some benefits, what it can be utilized for as far as auto-regulation goes, and then also just some tangential benefits of velocity-based training that come along from just viewing your performance with a velocity-based device. So Josh, go ahead.
Yeah, man. So there's a couple of reasons I wanted to have this segment on velocity-based training. The first is that I think it's kind of hazy when people talk about velocity, and I kind of want to provide at some point during the segment like a very straightforward overview of like what velocity can tell you, because I think it is straightforward. I think a lot of people kind of overcomplicate it, and I don't want to say oversell it, but just kind of like, again, make it more complicated than it needs to be. That's one reason. Another reason is a recent meta-analysis came out it was by Orange and colleagues. And just reading that paper was really, really interesting. And again, just kind of like made me think about, okay, how can we take the research we have right now on kind of traditional resistance training methods versus velocity-based training? And, what does that mean for practice? And obviously kind of layering on our practical experience, both using it ourselves with training as well as with athletes. So in the past, like OG listeners of the podcast, when we've talked about velocity-based training and probably like episode 5 or something, we've said that we think that RPE gets you 99% of the way there. And I think I still agree with that to some degree, but kind of based on practical experience and just kind of, I guess, getting better at using it and seeing the potential use cases, I might bump that down a little bit if kind of used properly. I think there are some clear benefits for a lot of athletes, but not all athletes. So I think this is personality dependent. I'm going to kind of be talking about the positives of using a velocity tracker today, but there can absolutely be drawbacks, right? I think that's important to kind of note right off the bat. The obvious drawback is that it costs money, right? I'd say like the devices available right now that we can confidently say are valid and reliable based on the research we have costs in the ballpark of like $400, right? So that's the obvious drawback. Other drawbacks include psychological considerations. Some athletes might be a little bit too neurotic for that, right? Some athletes might read into it a little bit too much. You also have to understand that if a misgroove happens, the velocity recording isn't going to be perfectly reliable. And again, some athletes might kind of struggle with that. And also there's just additional complexity. I've personally ran into that when kind of trying to use this with athletes, in that just adding one more thing to think about, often the juice just isn't worth the squeeze. Okay. So with those kind of caveats out of the way, I think we can kind of dive into, where the research is, and then the practical use cases that I kind of have landed on, at least at this time. So again, I alluded to that meta-analysis from Orange and colleagues, and I think they had 4 studies in that meta-analysis. They actually had a cool section of the paper, which was titled "Near Misses," which I thought was a pretty cool section to have, because there were a couple additional studies that you might look at and say like, hey, they also compared velocity-based training to some sort of other load progression method, but they kind of explained why they weren't included in the meta-analysis. But nonetheless, the idea is there's like 4, 5, 6 studies or so that kind of get at this question of, hey, is there an inherent benefit for strength gains in the time course of like, a typical training study, 4 to 10 weeks? Is there a clear benefit to using velocity compared to traditional methods such as just using percentage of 1 rep max, right? And this meta-analysis was really, really well done, really well written. And basically they're just like, yeah, this is totally inconclusive. And I think just subjectively kind of going through the studies one by one, I think it's pretty clear we need more research to kind of indicate whether there's a clear benefit. So again, research is inconclusive, large degree of heterogeneity in kind of the methods and exactly how things are prescribed. So again, this is kind of similar to what we talked about on a recent episode, in the sense of like, okay, we have a meta-analysis kind of indicating no difference, but at the same time, that doesn't mean we can't like dive a little bit deeper. We can't say like, okay, there might be kind of wrinkles in this concept that we can apply to practice, right? So I'll kind of now move into the use cases in practice, and again, what the benefits I've found. So we first, I think, need to think about why autoregulation is helpful in the first place, right? So autoregulation from a high level is basically saying like, hey, you are adjusting the training you are completing on a given day based on your performance for that day. And a lot goes into performance. Obviously, how quickly you're getting stronger, you're getting bigger, right? Those are factors that are going to influence your performance on the day. And as we've talked about a lot on this show, some individuals might be higher responders to training, some might be lower, right? So if you kind of give a general prescription of, hey, add 2.5 kilos to the bar every single week, that's not going to count for everybody, right? Then we also have daily readiness factors, right? We have outside of training variables that are going to vary between individuals and also within an individual across time, right? Work stress levels, sleep factors, other life stressors. Okay. Then also we just kind of have general fluctuations that we can't really explain in performance. So the idea of autoregulation in the first place is to kind of account for and match the training to this individual rate of gain as well as daily performance fluctuations. Okay, so that's the idea of autoregulation in general. The most common way to apply autoregulation or to actually employ it is rating of perceived exertion, right? Velocity can kind of be viewed as like an alternative, although they're not necessarily mutually exclusive, but an alternative to prescribing training and executing training, okay? And from a high level, there are two primary use cases for using velocity to autoregulate your training, okay? And I kind of mentioned that I don't think this needs to be overcomplicated. There's really two primary use cases. This is it. The first is to auto-regulate load using your first repetition velocity, okay? So this is best done with what's called a load velocity profile. So in other words, if you're testing, right, your 1 rep max, on your way up there with every single load that you lift, you're going to record the velocity of that repetition, right? And then once you find out what 100% of 1RM is, you can back calculate and say, oh, I hit my 1RM ended up being 200 kilos, and at 150 kilos, which is 75%, which you now know, it was this velocity, right? And then you can plot that out and get an idea of, okay, I know that my velocity, if my velocity is whatever, 0.4, this, this kind of correlates with this percentage of 1 rep max for that given lift, okay? And this seems to be relatively consistent. So when kind of preparing for this podcast, I look back at all the load velocity profiles I've done for myself. And at a given percentage of 1RM, they've all been within 0.02 meters per second. And anybody that's used a velocity tracker before kind of knows that that's a very, very small difference. So basically spot on. I would say if you took a ranked beginner and did this and had them do it, whatever, 6 to 12 months later, it would probably be different. But again, we can use first repetition velocity to kind of indicate the percentage of 1RM for that day's max. So the idea is, okay, we have these factors that are going to influence daily readiness. We want to use 80% of your 1RM on that day, which is going to be influenced by all those factors, right? And then we can use first rep velocity to determine what 80% is on that day, right? So that's the first way. The second use case for velocity is to indicate your RPE, or your number of reps in reserve, using last repetition velocity. Okay. So this seems to be consistent across, around 65 to 85% of 1RM for a given lift. So in other words, if I were to, do a set to failure with 65% of 1RM on the squat, and also do a set to failure with 85% of 1RM on the squat, and I kind of back calculated and said, okay, at 3 reps in reserve or a 7 RPE, it was this velocity. And if you did that for both the 65% of 1RM set and the 85% of 1RM set, those would align for each RIR, or at least be pretty close, right? So in other words, you can basically take a set to failure within that range, and then you can basically assign a velocity to a given RIR, right? And then you can auto regulate your RIR or your RP using that last rep velocity based on the desired RIR or RP, and thus now you're using velocity based training. Okay, so again, from a high level, you're basically 2 use cases: using first rep velocity to indicate the percentage of 1RM, and using last rep velocity to indicate the number of reps in reserve. So I'll pause there and see if you have anything to kind of add in there.
The main thing would be with the last repetition velocity stuff. While from a practical perspective, and my personal use of it as well, like it is a pretty darn stable number. I do think if we're talking from like the research that we have to validate those relationships, not validate in like a formal sense, but more like a colloquial sense. I would also say it's probably limited to like moderate to long rest periods, specifically exercises that are using like a linear bar path. So like that's, you mentioned the squat, which is obviously when we're talking about this kind of stuff, usually what we're referring to are the main barbell exercises, your bench press, your overhead press, your deadlift, your squat, that kind of stuff, as opposed to, exercises that have potentially deviations in the bar path or maybe more angular. So like a leg extension, stuff like that. You can get creative and start hooking up the velocity thing to the actual weight stack on certain machines, and you can get around it certain ways like that. But ultimately, there are some other constraints there, and I'm not sure like if different resistance types would impact that. I just don't know. Like cable machines and stuff like that, where the resistance curve is exactly the same as it would be in like a free weight movement. Maybe that affects it. We simply just don't have research to say that super confidently. So those are just some additional factors to keep in mind when using this. But in the instances of everyday training, when we are using those barbell movements, for the most part, in that loading range that Josh just said, your volume work almost certainly is going to be somewhere in that 60 to 90% of 1RM range. So that 65 to 85 is right within that. Again, from our practical experience, the utility of those numbers seems to be super spot on for the most part. So yeah, that's I think that's a really simple kind of model to utilize velocity-based training. Of course, I think there are additional things you could add in, but if you're trying to get started and saying what are the 2 most basic ways that I can use this and probably get over 80% of the benefit, I think exactly what you said is the way to go.
Yeah, like some listeners might be like, "Oh, why aren't you guys talking about how to use velocity loss, or how to auto regulate rest periods based on velocity loss?" Like, honestly, we don't really use velocity loss in practice. I think it's a pretty useful, in some contexts, way to standardize a training study. It does come with some limitations, which I think you're about to point out, Zach.
All I was going to say is like I do think it has one specific use case. Now, again, skip this part if you're just trying to get started with velocity-based training. Like Josh's, original 2 points, I think are by far the most important thing. I think velocity loss can be useful to some degree when comparing within an individual, within a lift, and within a loading range, but helping you potentially auto-regulate reps per set at a given load. And so that is still somewhat related to proximity to failure. But the reason I bring that up is if you're training pretty darn far from failure, you don't really care per se between like a 7 or a 6 RIR or whatever. Like that doesn't really make a ton of sense. And I think the RIR ACV relationships probably get a little bit less. This is just a total subjective guess. Probably gets a little bit less consistent the farther you get from failure. And so I use it a lot when, maybe my prescription for the day is, 80% of 1RM on the bench press, and I'm going to accumulate a given amount of repetitions, and I'm trying to complete those in a given velocity loss window. Now, again, could you use last rep velocity to do the same exact thing? Sure. But I think that the reason I like velocity loss there is, like you said, it's kind of a way to auto-regulate the rest periods too. And you just kind of look at it, take a quick look at one number. I don't have to look at my own profile, and I kind of know where I want to be at. So I definitely think it's a very much lower tier option, but I think it can be potentially useful, like you said, in some cases. But that's, again, definitely a second tier thing.
Not to say velocity loss is useless, but like you could also do a similar thing using last rep velocity. So you could say like, oh, I know that whatever, once I get to this last rep velocity, then I'm starting to get kind of in a higher RP range than I'm looking for. So I'm going to drop the number of reps per set. So
in short, the only reason I say what I said is because I'm lazy and I don't want to pull up my own profile of my last rep ACV to know what my RIR is. And Josh is 100% right. You very much could do it that way. But velocity loss is easy. I just remember one number and I'm like, yeah, all right, just stick around that.
Yeah, and the more I think about it, the more I think about it, I think there's benefits to using last rep velocity as opposed to velocity loss in this context. But that's a rabbit hole we probably don't need to go down for
because
right
if
now.
your first rep velocity decays, that kind of stuff. The other
Right,
thing I
set
was
to
going to
set.
say, just to talk about velocity loss, one more thing is, like, I do think it still can be useful in scenarios. Like, just an easy example is like, when we talk about velocity loss in the lab, sometimes I'll often bring up that it might be useful for like team sports settings. So if you're sharing a velocity loss unit with a bunch of your buddies, because like you said, they're pretty expensive, and you all have them in your gym, and you all want to kind of use it together, it might just be easier to use that in that instance. Whereas it may be a slightly more impractical to have everybody have their own individualized profile and all that kind of stuff. It just may be a little bit more headache to deal with in some of those scenarios where it's just a little bit less logistically feasible for everybody to have their own profile, get a clipboard where it says their profile. You know what I mean? It just takes a little bit more effort. I still think, like you said, I think that has considerable benefits because there are tangible limitations to velocity loss that aren't always easy to spot when you first use it. But yeah, just to say it's not useless.
Yeah. All right. I think we've done that justice. So I'll kind of move into the primary benefits I see in practice. So again, to recap, okay, we have a few studies, basically inconclusive. Autoregulation is probably good. RPE probably gets you most of the way, but for some people, but not everyone, there's probably some tangible benefits to using velocity in your training. And again, the way we're going to frame this is around using first rep velocity as well as last rep velocity, right? And now, okay, let's get into the very, very practical benefits. So let's see, I have 4 here. The first is using velocity as feedback during your volume work. Okay. And importantly, this is descriptive feedback for your volume work, not necessarily prescriptive feedback. So, in other words, you're not necessarily changing your protocol in that session based on the velocities you're seeing, but instead, there might be improvements to the quality of your training by just kind of seeing the velocity numbers themselves, right? So there's a couple papers from Weekly and colleagues that I think kind of point to this and also align with what I've kind of noticed in practice. So there's one from 2020 where they looked at average concentric velocity during a set of 10. I think it was like about 70%, so not to failure. And they just looked at different encouragement strategies. So they looked at verbal encouragement was one of them, and another one was looking at velocity feedback on an iPad, and they compared that to no feedback or no encouragement at all, right? And looking at the velocity on an iPad and kind of getting that immediate feedback increased the average velocity of that set of 10 by about 6.5%, which was a similar increase to when they had researchers shouting at them, encouraging them, which can be pretty potent. So that goes to say that, hey, we might see kind of an improvement in training quality. Being able to move a given load at a higher velocity means you're producing more force, you're applying more intent into the barbell, and that might have a tangible benefit in the long term in terms of just improving training quality and thus training outcomes. right? There's also a paper from 2019 by Weekly, and this was a 4-week long training study. So that's a limitation in and of itself. It's only 4 weeks long. And also the differences between groups were trivial to small. So not a huge difference here really at all. But they did see slightly better 3-rep max strength gains when using velocity feedback compared to no velocity feedback. Okay. So again, there might be like some tangible benefits to literally just seeing feedback in terms of velocity, right? Not even necessarily auto regulating with it, right? And I think, again, to make this very, very practical, it just kind of makes things more engaging. So, for example, let's say you're doing 200 kilos for triples on whatever, the deadlift, right? And okay, these are, more in like the RP 5 to 7 range. Last week, you did 195 kilos for these triples. This week, you're doing 200 kilos. And you have your last rep velocities recorded from the previous week. Hey, maybe let's see if we can match them, right? Add 5 kilos and match the last rep velocities from last week. I personally find that very, very engaging and just kind of like a game and another way to kind of detect where I'm at in terms of performance. Okay. So that's the first primary benefit in practice is just kind of that feedback for volume work. Another one that's I think overlooked is using the range of motion feature on a velocity tracker. So, we're kind of talking about actually getting that average concentric velocity value. But another feature on a linear position transducer is it tells you how far the barbell travels, right? And this can be really helpful for getting immediate feedback on depth in a squat. So, in other words, you can kind of do a trial period, take some videos directly from the side, or have a buddy tell you, hey, that squat was to depth. That was about 1 inch below depth. That was a little bit high. And you can kind of like look at, okay, what does that align with in terms of the range of motion that the linear position transducer is indicating, right? So that allows you to basically get feedback on depth on every single repetition without having to record from a perfect angle for every single repetition. So that's a very, very small benefit, or that's a very small kind of niche thing, but I've found it helpful in multiple cases. Okay. The third one the third benefit in practice I see with velocity is to kind of like help you determine where you're at when your perception of effort is off. So, in other words, this is something we've talked about in the podcast in the past, is that sometimes how hard something feels doesn't necessarily indicate how hard it actually is, right? I think most of the time, a well-trained lifter is probably going to be pretty accurate in terms of determining, how many reps in the tank they have. But I think there are specific cases in which your perception of effort and your ability to kind of rate how hard something was is quite off. So a really common one is when you haven't touched heavy loads in a while. So whatever, you did a couple training blocks that were higher rep and you just didn't really touch anything 85% plus. You get back to touching 85% plus and everything just feels like a house, right? Everything feels like an RP 9 to a 10. But if you have the velocity, you might be like, oh, wait, that's actually, considerably easier. It just, my perception of effort is off. Another example is if for whatever reason you're going into a session with lower caffeine intake, right? Your perception of the difficulty of a repetition might be a little bit inflated due to, being non-caffeinated. Another one is mental fatigue from, work or school, right? If you just came off a long workday, there's some indication in the research that mental fatigue might influence perception of effort. And again, we have a previous podcast on that. If you go to the one we talk about, I think the title is like, how hard are we training? Additional considerations for RAR rating accuracy. We go into that in depth. Another one that I personally ran into recently is when your hands are fatigued. So in other words, like when just overall fatigue is high, a lot of people have the phenomenon that like your hands just feel fatigued and everything feels hard to grip. So on deadlifts, everything just feels really, really heavy. And again, that might kind of inflate your perception of how difficult a given repetition was. But if you have that velocity feedback, you can be more objective about it and get a more accurate gauge of where things are at. Okay. The final benefit and this is probably like the most helpful one, I would say, is going to be using buildups. So I think the best way to illustrate this is with an example. So let's say in a given exercise throughout a block, you're doing build up sets of 4 on, again, let's just use a squat as an easy example. In week 1, you're going to do build up 4s until you get to RP6. In week 2, you're going to do build up 4s until you get to RP7. Week 3, build up 4s until you get to RP8. Week 4, build up 4s until you get to RP9, right? What you can do is you can take the same loads for some of those final warm-ups, or maybe like your RP6 set in week 3 is the same as your RP6 set in week 2, right? And you can look at the last repetition velocity of the same exact set week to week, and that can inform the next load jump because it's a really good indication of where you're at, right? So it can inform, what your RP was for that previous set, and kind of determine your general trends in performance over time, as well as what next jump to take for that week, right? A similar concept is load jump constraints. So this is something that we like to use when we're really trying to constrain someone with a given protocol. So we can say, hey, kind of add 5% for your final warmups, but only go to that next jump if your velocity of the set you just did is at or faster than a predetermined number. Okay. So that's kind of a way to incorporate these concepts of first rep velocity and last rep velocity within a training block to gauge progression and determine what loads to hit for that given session. Zach, I'll kick it to you and see what was unclear or anything you want to add.
First thing would just be just defining real quick what buildups are. What Josh means by that is instead of warming up to a set of 4 with doing 5 reps with the bar, maybe 2 reps with 1 plate, and then just doing singles till you get to your top set. What he means by that is doing sets of 4 with every single load that you're using on the way up. Just wanted to make that a little bit clearer. And so each week,
or at least once you get to like something that isn't like a super light warm up.
Sure.
So like
yeah. Once you get past the first 2 warm ups that are basically just stretching with a little bit of load or whatever. So that'll be the first thing. Other than that, like I think a lot of the feedback stuff's interesting, and I always just try to think about ways we can do that without the need of other equipment, right? Because like not everybody's going to be able to get a velocity unit despite some of these benefits that we're discussing. So I'm just trying to think now, like what are ways we can attack a lot of those similar mechanisms without the equipment, or at least get close to it. Of course, there's a reason that this is beneficial, and you'd want to try to mimic it as much as you can. But I think this is somewhat indirect indication, especially the 1 weekly study that you mentioned. Having a training partner could be beneficial to really give some verbal encouragement while you're training. That seems to mimic some of the effects of velocity feedback. So I think that's something to take into account. I also wonder if you could somehow use like subjective sensations of speed to have like weight ranges and somewhat. There needs to be a study. I don't know I just don't know if there is, like, because everybody has like that sensation of when velocity has declined. We need to try to quantify that and like see how much different that is between individuals, just to like somewhat give people tools to use that. So that'd be interesting. But yeah, I'm really just kind of spitballing here, just trying to take some practical takeaways that while Josh has very clearly laid out a ton of the benefits to velocity-based training and some of the indirect effects that we just discussed, what are some practical takeaways that we can use for people that potentially may not have this equipment. Now, the last thing I'll say is that hopefully, and I'm optimistic this is the case, certain apps and stuff like that is going to be coming and hitting a wave here soon, to hopefully give more people access to these devices at a lower cost. So I'm optimistic that's the case as well. But I don't know if you have anything off of that, Josh, before we roll on to the next thing.
Yeah, so you were kind of talking about ways to get the benefits of velocity feedback without a velocity tracker, right?
Yeah, basically, what can we learn from all the things you just discussed and try to apply those to somebody that doesn't have a velocity device potentially.
Yeah, I mean, I kind of set this up as like the inherent benefits to a velocity tracker, but I see what you're saying, right? And I kind of mentioned that the improvement in velocity in that set of 10 was 70% from getting velocity feedback was similar to verbal encouragement. So that's one takeaway is like, hey, training environment might matter, right? Maybe the value of a linear position transducer is a little bit higher if you train alone. But I'd also say that there's going to be kind of personality differences as well, right? Like some people are going to do well with this, verbal encouragement from other individuals, and some won't.
The main thing I was going to say that I think is severely overlooked by a lot of people is I think very clearly describing and maybe even demonstrating what it means to train with maximal intended concentric velocity is something that takes time. And that may be one of the reasons that some of these benefits kind of exist. And I think that's one of the obvious benefits of velocity based training is it's basically it's gamifying that, like you said, of like that learning process. So I do wonder if that is extremely clearly demonstrated to an individual and like telling them to do a repetition and maybe like saying no, you can still go faster because this is it's an uncomfortable and potentially it feels dangerous when you do it the first couple of times and you're not habituated to moving with absolute maximal intended concentric velocity on certain lifts. Like I know squatting, for example, if you don't groove it right, it can feel kind of weird and unstable if you've never done it before. So ultimately, that's one question I have is I think this entire scope of research, I think, just highlights that's an important training variable that probably often isn't stressed enough. And it's something that takes time to learn. And velocity may just kind of augment that process. To which, if you don't have a device, just understand that that's really important, and that may be one of the reasons these mechanisms are showing benefits. So when you're in the gym and you're training, especially for the stuff that is maybe a little bit lighter, I think it's really important to try to lift that with as much force and consequently velocity as possible for a given load to hopefully get as much benefits out of those adaptations as possible. Now, obviously, standard caveats apply here. That's not going to be fit for every single exercise, every single training goal probably isn't. But I think predominantly we're talking about strength here, and like I said, it's not going to apply in every situation, but for the most part, I think that's a good rule of thumb.
Yeah, I think the feedback also helps you learn when it's appropriate to use maximal intent and when to kind of lean into the fact that like, hey, this rep is going to be slow, and if you try to rush it, you're going to screw yourself over. So like, in other words, if you try to like rush a deadlift off the floor that's 90% plus, your velocity might actually decrease because you failed to be patient. Or on bench press, if you try to if you try to kind of start flaring your elbows and start driving the bar back before you even initiate the concentric, that might actually slow the barbell down. So like, in addition to okay, uh, you know, accelerating the learning process of how to actually use maximal concentric intent in volume training, it also kind of accelerates the learning process of when it's appropriate to focus on that and when it's not.
I would say the only thing I'd say to that is I don't think those are mutually exclusive at all. I think that's just part of the skill of doing it. Like you would be setting yourself up for failure if you're not trying to lift a maximal load with maximal intended concentric velocity because you'd be applying submaximal force. You just want to do that in the appropriate constraints, and that's kind of what I was saying with like doing that on a squat and you don't know what you're doing, you've never done it, you're going to be applying force at a non completely
Mm-hmm.
straight up and down line, and you might like do it like this, and that's where you get way on your toes, for example. And this is why a lot of the velocity-based training research often will use Smith machines for that fact. I think at least I think that's probably one of the reasons it makes everything a little bit more consistent. The costs of doing that is a little bit less and mitigated. So in my mind, I don't think those are two different things. I think those are the same thing. But like you said, your point is 100% well taken in that you need to be experienced with it for it not to turn into a con. You should want to do it. And part of that learning process is learning how to do that and make it work for you rather than against you. But I still think that's something you should try to implement in all repetitions pretty much for strength.
Yep. Right on. I think we're saying the same thing, just probably from two angles. All right. With that, I'm pretty excited for this segment from you, Zach. 'Cause I know you dug into a good amount of research here, and it's a very common narrative to say, and we've said it as well before. And Zach, you'll dive into this. Like, hey, if you're training with light loads, you got to take it to the house, or you got to take it within 1 to 2 reps of failure to maximize hypertrophy per set. Um, so yeah, I'll just kind of leave that cliffhanger there and let you run with it, Zach.
Yeah, for sure. So I think the way that I want to start this, like Josh said, kind of what we're going to be talking about is at least the research that we have. It's no secret we enjoy talking about proximity to failure. And we often talk about that in the context of strength. And usually, one of the caveats we'll hear us very specifically say is with moderate to heavy loads. And that usually comes in the loading range, what we're talking about there, somewhere 10 to 12 RM and heavier, which is generally, somewhere 70 to 75% 1 RM and up. So we'll have like kind of one set of discussion for that. But, it's been kind of our line of thinking that, if you drop, somewhere below that loading range, things might change. And I think that comes from a very safe kind of, you know, line of thinking and logic behind it. But the research itself is kind of messy, and I think it's definitely something that's basically what we're going to talk about in this segment, for both strength and hypertrophy, and kind of looking at these studies that do utilize lower loads and ask ourselves the question: does this kind of general recommendations of proximity to failure change very much? And so the first thing I think that's important to discuss is like, okay, from like a theoretical rationale, why do we think the relationship might change? And so there's, a lot of people have like different understandings of the physiology here. And I think the important thing is that we always like to stay on the front end is you can really come up with, a physiological kind of theoretical reason why something may be important depending on what factors you think are more valuable than others, whereas somebody else could come up with something completely different. So that's why we really like to rely on the actual longitudinal studies that look at this over time and actually investigate the outcomes that we actually care about, which is what we're going to talk about. But I do think it's important to kind of start, okay, in the absence of evidence, why are people kind of assigning this relationship? And so when we talk about, strength or hypertrophy, there's kind of this, recipe that we're trying to basically create in order to hopefully stimulate adaptation. And the first thing to kind of talk about there is just Henneman's size principle. So Henneman's size principle is one of the basic, concepts of muscle physiology that basically states that motor units, which are going to be part of our nervous system that innervate or control the activation and force production of muscle fibers, are recruited or basically brought into the game, is something you'll often hear us say, in the order of their size. And that's basically what the size principle says. So at the start of a set, lower threshold motor units that are going to innervate generally slower twitch fibers. And then as a set progresses, you're going to start recruiting gradually larger and larger motor units till you get to what are called high threshold motor units, meaning they have a high electrical recruitment threshold before they kind of come into the party and start to participate in contraction. The idea is those motor units innervate faster twitch fibers on average. Now, motor units aren't completely, uniform. There's definitely different fiber types within there. Fiber types can change a lot. But this is just a concept, again, from like a high level perspective. And those faster twitch fibers in general seem to be more responsive to training than the, on average, slower twitch fibers of the lower threshold motor units. And the point is there, if we can get those higher threshold motor units recruited within a set, the idea would be our yield of adaptation is going to be greater. There's a lot more nuance we could go into of the time spent with a given amount of recruitment, the force velocity relationship on the whole muscle versus the fiber level. I'm not going to really get into all that. I think this is the most foundational component to understand why people kind of think this. And so the way in training that people often assume Henneman's size principle is basically controlled is for two different ways. Well, actually three. The first would be load. So if you're lifting heavier loads, that is going to necessarily require greater amounts of force production, which I'll caveat that statement in a little bit here, but just follow with me for a second, to produce, actually to lift the load successfully. So if I'm training with 80% of 1RM versus 30% of 1RM, the assumption would be I would recruit more high threshold motor units with a heavier load, thus more faster twitch fibers that seem to be more responsive to training are participating in the set. Therefore, the idea would be, we would get a greater yield of adaptation and hypertrophy and strength. Now, your immediate question might be, okay, so why do we see similar adaptations in muscle growth from high and low loads if that's the case? That's where the second thing comes in. And this is where a lot of the early evidence of taking low and high loads all the way to failure is really applicable. And this is where, we have the second kind of route to getting high levels of motor unit recruitment would be increasing fatigue. Fatigue seems to kind of decrease recruitment thresholds. Again, more nuance, that's unnecessary, but that is going to allow those higher threshold motor units to be eventually recruited sometime in the set as you kind of accumulate fatigue and get closer to failure with those lower loads. So now, to some degree, we have similar levels of motor unit recruitment with both high and low loads. The routes of getting there is just slightly different. And so the idea there would be, hey, we weren't able to get maximal motor unit recruitment with light loads farther from failure, because as we just mentioned, that first repetition probably is going to result in greater motor unit recruitment from the higher loading conditions. Thus, the way that we often frame the argument, especially for strength, this not necessarily the way that we think about it, but I guess you could view it through this lens, is that those heavier loads would allow for sufficient conditions for adaptation, whereas the lighter loads may not. And so that's really where the kind of line of thinking comes from, is that if we're not going to have very high levels of high threshold motor unit recruitment with lower loads, it's probably a good idea that we take those sets all the way to failure to ensure that we are getting those higher threshold motor units in the game, the fibers that they innervate participate in contraction, and thus can be stimulated for adaptation. Now, a lot of assumptions there, like a ton of things that, maybe, I don't even know, maybe months ago I would have been comfortable with that I'm just not super comfortable with now. So I don't know if I would take that line of thinking, more than, this seems justifiable, but I don't think I would base training off of that.
Yeah.
Physiology is super complicated, and for every mechanism you can well define and pinpoint, there's a feedback loop that we're not even investigating that probably is going to influence that relationship too. So I just have a hard time taking that, diagram you draw up in the sand and then taking that immediately in the gym to design training, which again is why we find these outcomes super, super important in this conversation. And so just to hit on the third thing there that I think muddies this water even more, that we really don't have a ton of good answers to in these lower load studies, is the influence of what we just talked about in the velocity-based training topic, is how fast you are trying to move a given load. In theory, if one of the reasons that we might see higher motor unit recruitment with heavier loads is we're producing more force, which requires, muscle fibers to do that. If I'm lifting the same load with maximal intended concentric velocity, that also is additional force production in comparison to lifting that with a submaximal, concentric velocity. Theoretically, that probably would also lead to greater motor unit recruitment. We just don't know to what degree load has that interaction from like a training perspective. You can really only do this kind of question in isometric research, which has a whole host of limitations when we're trying to apply this into the gym. So again, I'm not going to get into it, but that's just another third factor that could kind of play a role in this discussion that I'm not going to totally hit on when we kind of go into the studies here, but it's something to keep in mind that could further modulate this relationship. Okay. So Josh, anything there before I kind of roll into the actual research here?
No, I don't want to kind of delay you, because I think, as you said, focusing on the outcomes is going to be important. But I just really, really want to emphasize that point, is like a model or like a mechanistic explanation is helpful because it allows you to take the outcome based research and generalize it. right? So in other words, you're working backwards from the outcome-based research to create a model so you can better conceptualize it and apply it. It's not the other way around. It's not that you are a priori saying this is how it works and thus, we have the keys to the universe, right? Because as you said, that's like what you just explained in terms of like recruitment thresholds, like that all kind of checks out if you read a muscle physiology textbook. But it's like, there's so much stuff that we just don't know, and like there's so many unanswered questions about how that process actually works, that running with that because that's what the textbook says is just gonna run into issues, right? So working backwards from the longitudinal outcomes.
The only thing I guess I'll add on that real quick before I just move on is it is challenging though, right? In our field where some people would argue that practice is always ahead of research, and you kind of have to try to use your logical inference in some way to kind of try to push the boundaries and keep trying to progress things forward. To which we get ideas to look at this stuff objectively in research and all that kind of stuff. So I don't want to say people are bad or whatever for using kind of like mechanistic or theoretical ideas to inform training. I don't think that's a bad thing at all. We do it all the time. But it's just understanding that like, something could be a hypothesis that is generated from that kind of like tinkering and experimentation, to which we can take it into the lab and see if it holds up. But I just think the level of confidence you should have is something should definitely be scaled to kind of
Yeah.
the way that you came about that idea. So, and
Yeah, I
yeah,
totally agree. It should just inform your level of certainty, right? So like, if you don't have that longitudinal evidence and you're going off a mechanistic explanation because you don't have anything better to go off of, fine, right? Like you said, we do that all the time, and we talk about that quite often. We literally just talked about a meta-analysis that was inconclusive, and then kind of talked about why it still might be useful, right? But that's because we have kind of the absence of perfect research, if that makes sense. But anyway, I think we've done that justice.
cool. Okay, so we kind of have two different sectors of the low load studies, at least that I'm aware of, that we can kind of split things into. We have one sector that's kind of studies that are looking at velocity loss and with lower loads, so different velocity loss thresholds. Standard caveats apply for most of those designs. There's one that's a little bit different that we'll touch on. And then we have another kind of sector of just what I'll call traditional papers, where generally set equated, and they're just taking things to a different RAR, but a little bit more traditional. So we'll touch on the velocity loss ones here first. So there's 4 papers here. The first 3 I can summarize pretty quickly. So the first 3 are from a similar research group that we've talked about a lot. Basically, what they usually do will compare people doing Smith machine squats, and they will perform a fixed amount of sets and terminate those sets at different velocity loss thresholds. A lot of the studies we've brought up in previous podcasts, previous discussions, articles, things like that, there are kind of a lane of their studies that usually use loads somewhere in the 70 to 85% of 1RM range. They also have a few studies that have used lower loads. So when I'm defining lower loads for this discussion, are loads that are sub 60% of 1RM. So some people wouldn't consider that quite as low, but that's kind of my arbitrary cutoff. And so we have 3 of these studies that, like I said, there's one more that's a little bit different that we'll touch on. But the first 3 basically trained, individuals that were all trained, recreationally trained, and then one of the studies used professional soccer players, I believe. And the velocity loss thresholds ranged from 5 all the way up to 45% velocity loss. And just once again, just we stated up on the front, everybody's clear. A greater velocity loss threshold in general means you're terminating the set closer to failure. So a 10% velocity loss threshold but would be farther from failure in comparison to a 45% velocity loss threshold. And just to throw some numbers out as sort of an estimation here, the first study compared 3 different velocity loss thresholds. The closest to failure condition was like 3 to 4 RAR, and the farthest from failure condition was like 9 RAR from what I estimated. And there were no significant differences in estimated Smith squat strength there. So important caveat there, it's estimated 1RM. That was from a velocity associated with somewhere around 85% 1RM. So still a pretty heavy load, but that is an estimated 1RM. And there were some small effect sizes in favor of the lower velocity loss conditions for strength there. But I do think it's an important caveat with the studies in these designs that estimate 1RM from velocities, because it's a pretty reliable finding that lower velocity loss conditions probably have a favorable kind of velocity load profile in favor of kind of explosive strength. So if we're purely evaluating 1RM from submaximal velocities, it could be the case that that is a little bit inflated simply from the fact that the lower velocity loss groups might be able to move submaximal loads faster and not necessarily translate that all the way to 1RM strength. But we just simply don't know. 1RM wasn't actually tested, just something to keep in mind. So yeah, in that study, the load there, shoot, I didn't write it down. I believe it was closer around 50% of 1RM in that study. It could be off there, but somewhere around 50% of 1RM. But in that study, they didn't measure hypertrophy, but 1RM strength didn't really seem to be different between groups. And if anything, the effect sizes seemed to lean in favor of the groups training a little bit farther to failure, all the way up to like 9 reps in reserve. Next study, the one that used soccer players, again, this is not a great comparison because both of the velocity loss conditions were pretty low for the loads that they used. Average load was somewhere around 50-60% of 1RM in this study as well. They compared 15 to 30% velocity loss with somewhere around 10 RIR in the former and somewhere around 8 RIR in the latter. And no significant differences, again, in estimated Smith machine squat 1RM. But this one was estimated from a pretty fast velocity. So the consideration I mentioned in the last paper, I'm even more confident of in this one that, it could be kind of muddy in the water a little bit in the way that we're evaluating strength here. Effect sizes were trivial. Finally, the last one here was, again, another tough one that's not super useful because it's going to estimate the velocity loss conditions are both pretty low and pretty far from failure. Compared trained individuals, recreationally trained, Smith machine squat, 5% velocity loss versus 20% velocity loss. And this was at 50% of 1RM approximately. About 20 reps in reserve in the former and about 15 in the latter approximately. No significant differences in estimated 1RM squat. Again, from a pretty fast velocity, about 0.68 meters per second. That's a pretty fast squat still. So again, those caveats apply. But this time there was a small effect size in favor of the 20% velocity loss group for greater changes in 1RM strength. So that's something to notice, that when you're 50% of 1RM and you're training with 20 reps in reserve, that's probably a little bit too easy. We'll kind of summarize things at the end, but I'll keep rolling here. So the last kind of velocity loss study we have, and probably the most interesting one, to be fair, those first three are pretty inconclusive, but I included them just for sake of thoroughness, is by Terada. So the study by Terada and colleagues was with untrained individuals, and they used the bench press as the exercise that they utilized. There were two groups that were interested here. One of them trained with low loads, which was 40% of 1RM, to volitional failure, and the other one trained to velocity fatigue. Now, I don't want to get too far in the weeds on this, but the velocity fatigue that they took these sets to was not like a standard velocity loss cutoff. It was a little bit more complicated than that. And it wasn't totally clear how that was determined. So basically what I did is I just took the difference in the first set reps performed between the two groups to kind of give us a rough estimation of RIR. And that was somewhere around 6 reps in reserve in comparison from the failure group to the velocity loss group in this study. So a little bit more reasonable of a comparison for this as opposed to the first few studies. And basically what we saw here was that there were no significant differences in tricep thickness, pec thickness, or 1RM strength gains between groups. But there were some, one of them was moderate, one of them was close to moderate, 0.47 effect sizes. So those are pretty meaningful in the context of the research that we usually look at for the hypertrophy outcomes for the failure group versus the non-failure group. So those are definitely noticeable, effect sizes when we would look at that in any other context. Even with the no significant differences, that could just be a case of statistical power here. You would definitely turn your nose up at that and be like, oh, there's definitely probably something to notice here. For 1RM strength gains, however, the effect sizes flipped there, and the velocity loss condition actually did a little bit better. So the kind of summary here is that for the most part, 1RM strength in these studies doesn't seem to be particularly modified by proximity to failure. Now, in all of these velocity loss studies, a important caveat is that also is going to control the total number of repetitions that they're performing, which is undoubtedly going to influence the ultimate outcomes there as well, both hypertrophy and strength. So those studies are a little bit difficult because they're basically modulating two variables. They're holding sets static, but the repetitions and the proximity to failure per set are getting modified by the way that they're terminating things. But ultimately, the takeaway there in the one study that compared hypertrophy, that will go along with the kind of the second cohort that we have here, did seem to find a little bit better results for training to failure, but the overall 1RM strength gains did not really seem to be modulated by proximity to failure very much. So the kind of standard model may not necessarily make sense totally for 1RM strength gains. Hypertrophy remains to be seen, which we'll kind of get to in the second cohort here. But I'll stop there, Josh. I just talked a lot. Anything to summarize?
No, I know there's someone on the edge of their seats about the load used in that Rodriguez-Rosell study that you said you didn't write down. Looks like it was 60 to 61% on average for each of those groups. But yeah, I guess a quick question for you. From these 4, I think it was, velocity loss papers, it doesn't seem like proximity to failure influences 1RM strength gains when using low loads, right? Which is a similar finding to when using heavier loads, right? Like we've talked about before. What do you think that says about like practice? Like, do you see a practical application here? Beyond just the fact of like, hey, if for whatever reason you're trying to do like some really light volume work, or I guess the point I'm making is like very rarely will you be
For
doing
sure.
working sets with less than 60%.
100%. Yeah, no, I think, like you said, like you're not going to take those programs and just immediately put those into practice. Like I don't think anybody would ever train that way. Um, the thing about them that I think is informative of like, telling us what we potentially should do. Again, there's some pretty major caveats with the estimation of the 1RM in those few studies, but nonetheless, if we basically make the assumption that those are going to track somewhat accurately with the actual 1RM strength gains, if we were to actually test that, then I would basically say these studies are useful in further somewhat confirming that load is the predominant variable that seems to predict strength gains rather than these other factors. Again, the problem here is that we're both modulating, repetition volume and proximity to failure, so that makes it a little bit challenging. But ultimately, when you match load and you're trying as hard as you can to lift every repetition, which I do think is very important. Again, if you have two different groups and they're not using maximal concentric intent and you train to failure, if we come back to that theoretical motor unit model, maybe that's the instance in which it does matter, because you're using submaximal intended concentric velocity. That may not actually result in all the neuromuscular speculations to be sufficient for adaptation. So, to me, again, with limitations in mind, it seems to me that this is going to further support that when you're using maximal concentric intent and load is matched between groups, we don't really expect to see massive differences in strength gains, because load is going to be that predominant factor that seems to predict things so long as maximal concentric is utilized. But once again, 4 studies, pretty limited, but that would be my practical takeaway from this. It's more of an extension of the other higher load research that we generally talk about to kind of validate that concept a little bit more by moving it across the loading spectrum to really see, does this actually hold up if we kind of move it across the kind of the midline that people usually train at, if that makes sense.
Yeah. When you ask someone a question so that you can talk about something you want to talk about, that's exactly what I was doing, but you said exactly what I was going to say. Like, it just goes to show that, or I don't want to say goes to show, that's way too conclusive. It's some indication that some of those neuromuscular mechanistic explanations of why you might need to train to failure with lighter loads might not be the capital T truth. So anyway, I'll let you continue, but I think that's, even though there's not a direct practical application, I think there's like a more higher level understanding that can come from those, even if again they're not the most practical
For sure.
studies, at least for the average
Yep.
listener of the show.
Yep. Cool. Okay. So with that in mind, we'll kind of hop into the second set of 4 studies here that are more hypertrophy focused. I would say, let me just double check here. Yes, all of them used a within subject design. So let's get that out of the way on the front end here. Within subject design, basically, I'm going to take one individual, split them down the middle, and I'm going to assign each one of their limbs to a different protocol. Has a ton of advantages in hypertrophy research. Basically, is going to allow the researchers to control for all the environmental factors that a certain person would have that's completely different to another. Nutrition, sleep, stress, even just, a lot of times we try to not get subjects to exercise out of the lab. We don't know if that's the case, but theoretically, if they did do other activity, that would also be controlled for within an individual. So basically just allows us to account for a lot of those factors that are difficult to control for between 2 different groups of subjects. So that's a big advantage. For strength, one could make the argument that the cross-education effect kind of nullifies the 1RM strength gains observed. I have probably changed my mind on that the more that I've thought about it. So I guess we can talk about it a little bit here. So if I have both my limbs training, and theoretically, let's say there is a cross-education effect that is proportional to the training effect observed in that limb. So if my right leg gets stronger than my left leg, you would think the cross-education effect going from my right to my left would be greater than the other way around. Ultimately, what that would do, again, if I'm thinking correctly, I could be wrong about this, but this is my current line of thinking, is that would just mitigate the absolute difference between the 2 protocols. But if differences still emerge, I think that would make you even more confident that that's something that's worth noting rather than the other way around. So of course, I don't think it's necessarily as good as a between subject design for strength in some respects, but I do think it's not something anymore that we just wad up and throw in the trash because it's a within subject design, therefore not applicable to maximal strength at all. I'm a little bit skeptical of that nowadays. So I'm still going to talk about the 1RM strength gains. Take it with a grain of salt, but I do think it's something to know. Okay.
Yeah, I think the super quick. I think the cross education effect is like something you used to use for like if you're writing about a within subjects design like this as like, hey, this is a huge limitation. Like that used to be my go to or like how I traditionally think about it. But then I was like, wait, that's just it just doesn't totally make sense why it would be such a big limitation. So now it's like, okay, this is a potential limitation type of thing. I don't know for sure, but anyway, I think you described that well. It's like just something to keep in the back of your mind. But like you said, I don't think it kind of like makes these findings, not useful.
Yeah, for sure. Just like we talked about the other thing, basically you just have your little confidence meter. You just kind of roll it down just a little bit. Don't throw it all the way to the bottom end of the slider, but just probably roll it down a little bit before I even say anything, and then kind of go from there. Okay. So, like I said, a lot of these studies are very, very similar in design. They basically train with the same load and they match sets and then are going to manipulate again the number of repetitions in order to reach a different proximity to failure. So, actually, I believe now that I think about it, I believe the first study I'm going to talk about actually did equate sets. Josh, double check me on that. Check the Levisius study to see if they match sets because now I am double or second guessing myself. But ultimately, I'll talk about the rest of the design here. So the Levisius study, untrained individuals, and they used a unilateral knee extension. In one group, they had 30% of one arm or one leg train to failure. And the other leg basically did a volume load equated protocol, which is why I'm believing they did try to equate total repetitions to some degree in this study. And they trained to what I estimated based on the average repetitions performed, somewhere around 15 reps in reserve. So again, not a super practical protocol, but it allows us to kind of explore the bounds of this relationship. In this study, they did see significantly greater quad growth in the group training to failure. Effect size there was 0.30, but no significant difference in 1RM unilateral knee extension strength and that was a trivial effect size, 0.111. So there we see that, again, when the legs are training to drastically different proximities to failure at that load, the group training to failure did see significantly greater quadriceps growth, which I think is important to note. Moving to the next study. Go ahead, Josh.
I got you. I got you with that study. It looks like it was
Okay,
set equated.
set equated. So they did not add additional sets to help equate volume load. I should definitely have known this, but I just started second guessing myself as soon as I started talking.
Okay. I'm sorry. I'm incorrect there actually. So now this study design is coming back to me. So they used 60% of what they got in the
Right.
failure leg, and then did as many sets as necessary to match total
Yes.
training
Okay.
volume.
So that's what I thought.
So it was not set equated. I'm sorry,
Right.
it was not
Okay.
set
Yeah. So
equated.
the one I just discussed is basically more so repetition equated than it is set equated, which allows us to better isolate proximity to failure. So that's a really solid study for this, basically showing that even when training volume is equated, training to failure versus around 15 reps in reserve, it could be different than that. But again, it's pretty far from failure based on the repetitions performed. There was significantly greater quad growth in the group training to failure, but no significant differences in 1RM unilateral knee extension strength. Moving to the next, go
I
for
don't
it.
want to. I don't want to. I don't want to slow you down too much here, but I think it's interesting, and I can confirm this once you keep going. But like, if there was a time effect for hypertrophy in that group training to 15 RAR, like that is interesting in and of itself. I'll kind of confirm that here when you keep talking, but like, you kind of said, yeah, there was definitely greater growth in that group training to failure. And to be very clear, like we would never say to train with 15 RAR, but like if there was a time effect there, like that's pretty interesting
Yeah,
in and of
I'm not
itself.
super surprised if there was, just based on the fact that they were on trained individuals. So there probably was a probably really small but semi consistent positive effect. But I'm curious to see if you dig that up. So okay, rolling into the next study here.
All right, I'm sorry. I'm sorry. There was actually no significant increase in pre to post for low load not failure.
Okay.
So I kind of take that back. So that's interesting in and of itself. It looks like quadriceps CSA increased from 85.8 centimeters squared on average to 88. So, and that difference was not significant from pre to post. So kind of walk that one back actually in that
Cool. Okay.
there
So
was
I think
not.
all that basically just all that little additional discussion highlights the fact that that is a really solid paper to kind of somewhat justify there. It does seem to, in fact, be a threshold to some degree based on this one study that even when you equate training volume, training to very far from failure isn't, maybe not even sufficient to grow at all in comparison to training to failure. So the vicious study that we just discussed, really solid study to kind of look at this question. The Nobrega study, also used on trained individuals within subject design knee extension. This time they compared 30% to failure versus 30% to what's called voluntary interruption. Very basically, what this means is you're basically trying to take the set to as close to failure as possible without actually failing a repetition. So the RAR here is like 0 to 1 approximately. And so this is a really solid design to investigate the fact, does actually failing a repetition matter necessarily? Now, of course, voluntary interruption is still kind of a subjective thing, but based on some of the data reported, we can estimate they're pretty close to 0 to 1 RR objectively, and it's not just totally, subjectively evaluated, and they're like actually 10 reps in reserve. We're pretty confident they're actually like 0 to 1, maybe 0 to 2, but probably 0 to 1. And in this study, there were no significant differences in vastus lateralis CSA or 1RM unilateral knee extension, and both the effect sizes they were trivial, kind of demonstrating to some degree that that last repetition where you actually fail, maybe the last two repetitions, don't seem to provide a completely different stimulus that I think some like discussion online would sometimes suggest. If you take things pretty close to failure but not actually failing a repetition, you seem to get the majority of the benefit based on this study. The next study is by Lim and colleagues in 2019. This is an interesting one. They used untrained subjects again, and the limbs are randomized to 2 of 3 protocols. So they also have a high load protocol, but I'm not going to talk about that here. And basically, the training program was knee extension and unilateral leg press. That's relevant to our outcomes. In the 2 groups, we had 30% training to volitional failure, and then another leg that did 30% of 1RM, and it did volume load matched protocol in comparison to the group that trained 80% of 1RM to failure. And so what that works out to, as we discussed on kind of the last podcast, I believe, lower load conditions accumulate volume load way, way more efficiently than higher load conditions. Basically, repetitions are a more potent mechanism of increasing volume load, which is weight times sets times reps, than increasing the weight but doing fewer repetitions. And so what this results in is the 30% work match group to this 80% of failure group. They were probably around like 10 reps in reserve versus this group training to volitional failure with 30% of 1RM. And in this study, there was significant type 1 fiber growth only in the group training to failure, but there was significant type 2 fiber growth in both the group training to failure and the workload match group that was training, like I said, probably somewhere around 10 reps in reserve. Importantly, the effect sizes there were both moderate and large in favor of the group training to failure. For type 1 fibers, it was 1.47, and type 2 fibers, 0.65. The statistics there, as far as like the significant group by time interaction, was a little bit unclear, but I've really never seen effect sizes that big that didn't result in a significant group by time interaction. So I would imagine that was the case at least for type 1 fibers, if not both. But nonetheless, I think it's a very, very interesting finding. And this is a study that Josh and I have talked about multiple times and come away with different interpretations pretty much every time we discuss it. But coming back to our original kind of theoretical rationale of this motor unit hypothesis, if we're not taking a set with low loads all the way closer to failure, you could theoretically speculate if any fibers were going to grow, it would probably be the slower twitch type 1 fibers that are predominantly in the lower threshold motor units. And so the fact that we saw significant growth in both of these groups, despite the lower load group training with like 10 reps in reserve, is really, really interesting. And it may somewhat question that kind of model. Now, the major caveat here that Josh and I have talked about a couple of times is that this also could just be an artifact of the observation that type 2 fibers just seem to grow more in general. So that also could be the consideration there, because there was still a moderate effect size in favor of the group training closer to failure. And so it could just be that type 2 fibers grow more, but ultimately that's something to keep in mind. But I just think this is a really interesting study that I haven't heard discussed a ton, that kind of just gives us some insight into that kind of motor unit hypothesis and just adds further caution to it that, even if we're training pretty far from failure, these type 2 fibers seem to grow. And so the way that we were kind of thinking about that, increases in motor unit with fatigue being necessary with low loads may just be a different relationship than what is traditionally discussed. Coming into 1RM strength here, no significant differences in 1RM leg extension, but this was extremely unclear how this was actually done. They mentioned it was done by the indirect method, so I'm assuming it was some sort of estimation protocol based on a rep max, but I really don't know. The effect size there was trivial, but I'm going to kick it over to Josh to see a standing commentary on this one, just because this one is pretty darn interesting.
Yeah, I actually think this is basically the point I was trying to make with my inaccurate initial statement from the previous or the first study you went over in this kind of section, right? So like basically what you're saying is, hey, we have 30% to failure versus 30% training at about 10 reps in reserve. That was also probably like lower like stimulus or just lower volume based on the way they calculated the volume. And they still saw growth in type 2 fibers, right? In the group training with 10 RIR. That's pretty interesting in and of itself.
Yeah, I will say, if I recall correctly, the volume was pretty decent, if I recall, because they were doing it over 2 exercises, and I think it was 3 exercises in both exercises, 3 sets in both exercises, excuse me. And I think they were training 3 times per week. So I think it was a good amount of training, but it might have been 2 times a week as well, but I'm not totally sure. But ultimately,
Yeah.
I agree with your point. Like it just, that observation is very interesting to me. It adds further caution to just taking that kind of very speculative theoretical motor unit model and just running with it, because I think that would predict that, if anything, the fiber type that group would have grown would be flipped. But again, there's caveats to that I can think of to kind of counter my own argument. But again, just interesting. Okay, and so the final study we have here, very similar design to the Nobrega study, untrained individuals within subjects knee extension, where they have trained with low load, somewhere around 58% of 1RM, with one leg training to failure and one leg training to like this similar 0 to 1 RIR voluntary interruption kind of thing, where they're not trying to actually hit failure, but train pretty close to it. No significant differences here. The only thing that I'm pretty sure they did is they analyzed the percentage change scores, which generally this leads to some slightly different outcomes. So not super confident in that necessarily, but the kind of just looking at the differences qualitatively seemed to kind of work out in my mind. And so basically they had 2 measurements of muscle growth. They took a bunch of different lengths along the quads and made like kind of a composite score. And so they had a composite score for the rectus femoris and the vastus lateralis. Both of these were trivial effect sizes in favor of failure, 0.16 and 0.15 respectively, based on my calculations. And then the unilateral leg extension was also a very trivial effect size, 0.05. So nothing really interesting going on there. So ultimately, that further supports kind of the Nobrega paper with slightly higher loads, still in the low load category, but slightly higher than that, demonstrating that going to actual failure doesn't seem to be totally necessary, and leaving a rep or 2 in the tank, I guess usually a rep in this instance, it seems to be sufficient for specifically for hypertrophy, but also for strength. So that's kind of the second group of studies here. And so I'll quickly summarize here and demonstrate the problem that we have with this research is, for the most part, we have like 2 clusters of like RAR that people train with. We have all the way to failure and maybe like one or 2 reps in the tank, and then super duper far from failure. The one study that's kind of on the edge of practical is that Terada paper that we mentioned, which still seemed to have strength gains that somewhat favored the group training farther from failure, but the hypertrophy effect sizes seem to favor the group training to failure. But other than that, like I said, we have these kind of 2 clusters of RARs from the non-failure groups that are just 1 rep shy and like 10 plus. So it leaves a considerable amount of uncertainty for the ranges of RARs that people would actually train with for low loads. Now, like we discussed and Josh brought up, I still think there are some useful practical takeaways we can have from this research that's not necessarily completely useless, but it does leave like a really big range of studies to look at to give us some more insight onto how this stuff actually plays out. So ultimately, coming back to that theoretical model, I think it's definitely still theoretical at this point, and I don't think we've thoroughly investigated it with the longitudinal outcomes, at least that I'm aware of, to say that that is totally necessary, because those kind of middle of the road RARs that people would actually train with, somewhere 2, 3, 4, 5 maybe, just haven't really been investigated super thoroughly. And so that's kind of where I'm at with it for the moment. I would say, if anything, we can say the last rep where you're actually failing in comparison to stopping a rep shy, maybe 2 reps shy, doesn't seem to make a dramatic difference. And strength gains in general seem to be load dependent more than anything. And so those are really the 2 takeaways that I have from this body of research. And other than that, I just don't think that theoretical model is super well supported based on what we have. And there's just a lot of questions that remain, and definitely some studies that investigate non-failure groups kind of in that middle of the road, RAR range. In addition, maybe comparing two non-failure groups, or one group trains 1 or 2 reps shy and another group trains in that moderate range, would probably be an awesome comparison and study to do. So, Josh, I don't know if you have anything there. I just talked for a while.
Yeah, I think this is probably like the most thorough examination of this question that I've seen anywhere. So, and it's actually really interesting, even if you don't care about like training with low loads, or you don't really care about it within the context of 1 rep strength either. Because basically what I'm piecing together here as you go through this segment is like we don't we don't necessarily have the studies comparing like 3 or 4 RIR versus 0 to 1 RIR, but we do have some studies that would potentially make you question the mechanistic reason for why you would need to train very close or to failure with low loads. So, absence of evidence is not evidence of absence, in the sense that, okay, now we can conclude you can train with 3 to 4 RIR and still maximize hypertrophy with low loads, but it might kind of shift your priors a little bit and potentially adjust that hypothesis and just make you question, again, those fundamental kind of surface level muscle physiology explanations of why you would need to train very close to failure with low loads. That's kind of where I'm at right now. But also at the same time, like I will say, it's probably a little bit like quote unquote safer to train a little bit closer to failure with low loads
That's
at this time.
literally exactly what I was going to
Yeah,
say.
safer.
Yep. I think it's almost never worse to train to failure specifically for hypertrophy, for muscle growth. We have a few papers that would show like percentage change differences that maybe favor staying like a rep or two shy, but honestly, I'm pretty skeptical of that like being like a hard and fast thing. I would say in general for hypertrophy, if you really just don't want to think about this and like don't want to over extrapolate and be on the wrong side of guessing here, I think taking things all the way to failure, maybe leaving 1 rep in the tank for hypertrophy related movements, and maybe you scale that down a little bit for like exercises that are a little more challenging when the muscle's stretched. Multi-joint exercises, maybe you go a little bit lower, a little bit farther from failure in those instances. But if you just want a blanket statement of to say 100% foolproof, I would say take it all the way to failure, like 1 rep in reserve, and you're probably almost certainly going to get everything out of that set that you can. There may be downstream programming benefits, you might not be able to tolerate as much volume, stuff like that. But if we're purely talking about proximity to failure, I think that is by far the safest recommendation. Now, as Josh said, I do think there's room left for interpretation of like how you can view these results, and we're not necessarily in that business, right? Like we're just here to kind of present the longitudinal outcomes here, and like I just don't think there's enough to make a strong theoretical model with this to say you definitely can do this or you definitely can do that. And so I just think it's interesting, and I think we need more work to be super confident. But I think like just totally subjectively, it would make sense to me that like you can probably take low load sets, to similar RIRs that people generally train high load sets. I don't think there's a super strong reason that wouldn't be the case. So you probably can, maybe take a set to 4 RIR here every now and again, and in the correct context, probably be okay. But again, we don't really have sufficient data to examine that thoroughly. And so if you want the safe recommendation, taking it to the house
Yep.
and having
Yeah.
those miserable sets, that's probably your safest bet.
Yeah, and the recommendation to train closer to failure or to failure with low loads is also probably still good, because it is absolutely miserable to get anywhere close to true failure with low loads. Like if the load is light enough, like at some point you don't even know whether it's like your actual ability to produce force, like kind of like being the bottleneck, or just the fact that you've are in so much discomfort that like you're looking for a way to get out of the discomfort. So that's another reason why, even though we're saying, hey, this general recommendation might not be the best, it still might be, or the most accurate based on the research, it still might be good, because you can convince yourself something with 25 rep set is 2 RAR, but in actuality, if you had multiple researchers verbally encouraging you to go until you literally cannot complete another repetition, you might actually have more than that in the tank.
Yeah, it's so interesting when we have these kind of conversations because like we're speaking in the context of like very technically accurate of like these RAR estimations. Of course, that was another caveat I was going to make. I'm going to make sure I say it now before I forget. I roughly calculated the RAR. Of course, those aren't reported in the study, so that's another caveat to take. But I think I'm in the ballpark for the most part. It is reported like in the voluntary interruption kind of protocols. Those are a little bit easier because I can look at the reps reported and the reps in the failure group and that kind of thing. But yeah, just know that I did estimate those. But ultimately, what I was going to say is like in these kind of discussions when we're like trying to be very specifically technically accurate, you can kind of have two ways that we're saying. Like in one lane, we would say the recommendations probably aren't at this time totally technically accurate, but just like we do with the other stuff with like the talking about RER for strength, um, they may still be good actual recommendations when you take in the context of how people perceive things and actually train. Like you said, the discomfort with low load sets and stuff like that. So it's we've got to like come full circle in this conversation of like, is it technically accurate, and do we have sufficient evidence to be confident in saying you need to train much closer to failure with low loads than you do with high loads? I don't think so. Should that still be your operating model when you go in the gym tomorrow and you have sets of 25 on leg press to a 2 RIR? Probably. Like I think that's probably a safe bet, just because all the other contextual factors that go into rating those RIR and yeah, just the discomfort that associated with those kind of exercises and loading ranges is just something you definitely have to pay attention to in a practical sense. So their recommendations of taking it to failure or very close to failure are probably good for that reason. And so that's really coming full circle in this conversation. You can just erase the past 45 minutes or whatever we were talking about, and yeah, you just, if you never knew the underlying reasons, you could just operate the same way in the gym tomorrow.
Yeah, it's kind of like that. It's kind of like the arc memes where you start with like a very basic surface level conclusion, and then you go through the arc of like going back and forth and like changing your mind, and then you kind of come to the other side of the arc and you're like, I'm at the same place. But I do think you're at the same place as, when you started the arc. But I do think there is inherent value to going through that process that you just went through during the segment of understanding exactly why that's the case, right? Because like, yeah, you can look at some very surface level stuff and potentially end up at the same spot, but if you want to be a good problem solver for your own training or for your clients training, like understanding why this is the case, like that has inherent value, right? Maybe you run into yourself or an athlete has an injury or something, right? And you're looking for a way to train that movement in a tolerable way, but you still want it to be quote unquote effective to some degree. Understanding the nitty gritty of why you come to these broad strokes recommendations allows you to work backwards from them and apply them, apply them a little bit differently in edge case scenarios. So I think there is inherent value in kind of going through that process.
100%. Yeah, the last thing I'll say on this is, yeah, I think that highlights the last caveat I was going to make, was just individual differences, like understanding the why of why, or that doesn't sound right, the why behind this discussion can help you troubleshoot, just like you said, because undoubtedly what we just talked about for, again, last however long, is the average response. And we know, and that's been a theme of something we've been talking about a ton recently, is like, that's just not the reality for everybody. And if we know a little bit of the why behind, these relationships that we're observing, it will allow us to more effectively troubleshoot, and make the trial and error process a little bit less painful, hopefully. So just a very basic example is like, if the RER accuracy portion of, lower load training is potentially what can kind of seep into these recommendations, and you have a client that for whatever reason isn't getting effective results with low load training despite you making it what you think is reasonable, maybe that's the first place you look. And maybe you ask them like, hey, can you send me a set where you take it all the way to momentary failure after you stop the set initially where you think you're at your RR target, and things like that. Like that, it just kind of helps you take the next step from a practical perspective, and ask yourself, why are my observations potentially happening? And you can kind of go from there. But yeah, I'll
I
stop
I
belaboring this point and we'll
I
go
have
from
a
there.
I have a really good segue into this next portion, or this last portion of the podcast, and we can make this quick. It's about one of your clients, and like just a quick anecdote, and I'll pass this over to you in a second. But I think this is a really good example of how, you know 4 or 5 years ago, I probably could have written the same general starting point as I have right now for the average lifter in terms of their programming, because like I kind of understood those general evidence-based recommendations. But I think where, you want to be, and where, at least to some degree, I feel like as we gain experience as coaches, we improve upon, is the ability to troubleshoot because of a greater understanding of these things, both in terms of understanding, yes, the general recommendations from the research, but also how those general recommendations come about, um, individual differences, and all that good stuff, right? So anyway, I'm kind of teeing this up for you in terms of an outlier with one of your athletes that I think is really, really interesting to talk about, and how you've kind of troubleshooted to get to this spot. So anyway, I'll kick it over to you and let you kind of run with this.
Yeah, for sure. I think, this is something Josh and I always kind of discuss to ourselves, just about, making our coaching systems better, making sure we're able to come to the conclusion that's going to best deliver results from the client, rather than just confirming our own biases and stuff like that. And, I was talking to him the other day about one of the clients that seems to have a breakthrough after like a really long, not really long, but a decent bench press plateau, where, multiple meets where we kind of were hitting the same number. And I was just reflecting upon, and I think I said to you, like, he's one of the only clients I've been able to individualize training for, like in the exact way that I would want to on paper. He's had a few injuries here and there, but his upper body has been, relatively healthy, knock on wood. And that really hasn't, harm things too much. And that's particularly what I'm talking about, is his bench press. His lower body training also is in a completely different direction than I would ever start somebody with. So I think that's equally as interesting, but it's for different reasons. His, response to training and potential injuries and chronic aches and pains that popped up was kind of the reason for his lower body training that has shifted to something. Again, I would have looked at that training and thought there's no way that could be working initially when we started, but now his upper body training, on the other hand, it's just been kind of purely dictated on training response and objective progression. Yeah, go ahead.
Just to be clear, to add some context here, like this has taken very long for you. Um, like you can
two
probably
to three
speak to this.
years.
Yeah, 2 to 3 years. So like to
Yeah.
be clear, it's like we talk about how this stuff takes time, and we talked about, it was either last podcast or the podcast before, of like the importance of having some sort of system. Um, but like it just takes time. Like, and you're always kind of chasing your tail, because he's not the same athlete he was 2 to 3 years ago as well. Just wanted to add
That,
that context.
yeah, no, for sure, and it's important. And I think it's an interesting thing I hadn't really thought about till right now. Like, I don't know if I could have gotten to a similar place in a faster time period with what I know now and kind of the way that I view things now. Because I've definitely changed my mind on a lot of things in that last 2 to 3 years. Um, and so that's an interesting thing. But then also you have the consideration of, like you said, like over the course of that entire time period, he's also changing as an individual, to which the training interfaces differently upon him. So I don't even know if the answer with considering those two factors would be any different. But ultimately, like you said, it's very important to know, like, it's taken a long time to get here. And I think the first thing to highlight is that his patience and ability to be okay with small methodical change has paid huge dividends. Um, for that, like I said, it's just, it's one thing when we talk about individualization systems and how to do that appropriately, and how to make things, easily to detect what's going on as much as we can. But then you throw that in the context of the average person who has all this stuff that's just constantly changing, that, autoregulation can handle a lot of it, but, that's not going to catch everything. People's interests in training change. People's jobs change, people's, all those kind of things that can further kind of disrupt your nice, slow, methodical process. But this individual has been awesome with just being patient and just letting those small, methodical changes happen, over time. And yeah, it's been an awesome thing to watch. And like basically like the most recent thing that kind of happened that kind of made me start reflecting on it and kind of started our conversation is, like I said, for multiple meets in a row, he's kind of hit a similar bench number. And so we had been sitting on making the change of kind of upping his training dose to the highest, I've ever had somebody, to be just honest. And to be clear, he's an outlier, and there's a reason we probably wouldn't start many people there. But he just seems to tolerate training stress for his upper body very well. For multiple cycles, we would make changes to, just in our terminology, like the formulation, different exercise variations, different kind of approaches to what we're trying to attack. Of course, different loading ranges, that kind of thing. Trying to make as small methodical changes over time as possible. But if you've listened to kind of our content, we kind of think at the end of the day, the most kind of important variable for individualization is kind of dialing in this training dose. Which is kind of like this overarching concept of just how much work you're doing that takes into account pretty much every variable. And for him, he was recovering okay. He was already doing a bunch of work, and progression had kind of stalled out. To be clear, he's obviously a pretty advanced bencher. He's been doing this for a long time. He's extremely efficient. His technique's efficient. And he's been performing all that work with a very high quality for a long time. So like he had all the stair steps in place. Kind of took him to this 6 times a week benching recently. And yeah, that plateau got completely obliterated within the span of 4 weeks, which is just mind blowing to me because, like I said, it's been a long time, and those gains come slow and incrementally over the course of that time period. But yeah, we just kind of made this most recent change and found that training dose that seems to be he's tolerating well at this current moment in time, and just really seemed to respond extremely well, which is just, it's really satisfying. I think more than anything that like we did it the right way to get there. And like, there was zero risk in not zero, that's not, it was very minimal risk in my mind to do that. Whereas if you would put that training program on a piece of paper and show that to me, for the average person, I would say, no way, Jose, like that's not going to go well. But for him, that was 100% the right move, at least subjectively, at the time, because we had tried other things, and it just seemed like, based on his recovery, subjective perception of, could you tolerate some more training, logistically, all those kind of things, and his objective response just seemed like the right call, and we did it. And for the last couple of weeks has just been honestly ridiculous to me, like how well it seems to have been going. So yeah, it's been a cool thing, and just reflective of how can I better set athletes up for success to drill those kind of long, methodical, approaches to be effective and be successful and be adhered to. That's really the question, is like,
yep.
That seems to be, to me, like I was able to solve that problem. It took me a long time. Well, not sorry, that he did the work, to be clear. I'm just helping to guide the ship. We were able to solve that problem given enough time and given enough changes. But the reality is most people probably aren't going to be able to tolerate it for that long, and be as patient like he was. And I think that's his greatest virtue. So it's now the question is how can we change the process, or, create tools to hopefully try to speed that process up to make it so more people can be adherent to that kind of model, is where I'm at.
Yeah.
Where I'm at now.
Yeah. I think the job of a coach, or so let me take a step back. Basically, we have 2 principles in mind, right? On one hand, we have the principle that athlete engagement is key, right? The athlete needs to be engaged in their training in order to get the most out of it and execute it properly and be excited for training. That is very important. But we also have, on the other hand, that we need to be patient and methodical. So ultimately, the question is, how do we do both of those at the same time? For some individuals, it's going to be literally changing one variable at a time and the cycle looks the exact same, right? For other individuals, you might have to get a little bit creative in terms of what things you're changing to keep things fresh, to keep them engaged, but still keep the core structure similar so that you can do that methodical approach, right? And I just think, you're not like this athlete, he's a great guy and we're keeping him anonymous just because we didn't ask before to use his name, so we're not going to use his name. um but it's not to say like he's a higher character individual than another athlete that needs more frequent variation, or that he's a better person. It's just like acknowledging that. And kind of my starting point with an athlete is to take the more methodical approach, but try to be take the more methodical approach in the sense that things aren't changed willy-nilly, but to be very, very clear. Let me know if anything gets stale, like let me know if you're getting bored. I want to be the first to know that, and then we can kind of lean towards the side of like still trying to maintain that methodical approach, but getting fancy or getting creative in terms of how to still keep it engaging but still keep the core training stimulus similar, so we can have that methodical approach. And it's tough, man. Like, it's, you go in and you have a, maybe you're training your tail off but nothing's happening. It's a lot easier to say, hey, go be patient, than to actually be patient. So it's tough, like how to keep someone engaged, how to keep someone locked in. You go on Instagram and you see someone making a ton of progress on a different training approach, and that looks really enticing, so you want to go jump on that because that's the magic bullet, right? Like, trying to find solutions to all these things are just so tough. But having that methodical approach is just so key. And I think this is a really good example of it. And to be clear, to be very clear, it's an outlier. He's benching 6 times a week with like triple to quadruple the training stress we might start someone with, right? But you can get there with that methodical approach. And I just think, again, to be clear, it's an outlier, but that outlier is a good example of the importance of the methodical approach, right? So anyway, I just thought, we were talking about this in private. I was like, we should just chat about this on the podcast a little bit, because I think it's a really interesting example and just really good talking points. But yeah, I don't know if you have anything else to add. Cool. We'll go ahead and wrap it up here. We did not quite get to some listener questions, but within the next few episodes, we'll hopefully answer some questions on how you feel during a deload week, as well as overreaching for hypertrophy. So that's a bit of a cliffhanger there. To make sure you subscribe to the show, subscribe on YouTube, all that good stuff. Leave us a rating and review. Check out the description of this podcast to check out some of the stuff we offer if you want to support kind of what we do here at Data Driven Strength. Otherwise, thank you for sitting through this podcast. We hope you enjoyed. As always, if you have any feedback, feel free to reach out, and take care, everyone.
Thanks, guys.